Welcome to the Keeping the Earth Forum for Clergy and Faith Leaders. This forum is sponsored by the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance and co-sponsored by Arizona Interfaith Power and Light, the First Congregational Church of Flagstaff, Flagstaff Quaker Friends Meeting, and Unity of Flagstaff.
There's John.
So hello everybody, and welcome to the Keeping the Earth Forum. We're really glad that y'all came out to join us today. And I want to say at the beginning here that my name is Stefan Sommer, and I'll introduce myself to you in just a moment. During this, we're going to keep everybody's audio off just because of the complications of Zoom. And then when we do open it up for the forum part, we will be taking questions and comments through the chat. So we will make it as much of a discussion, even though we can't really open it up the way we would do in person. So again, welcome everybody to the Keeping the Earth Forum. This forum is sponsored by NASCA, the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance, and Dr. Roy May and I are both members of NASCA. NASCA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization here in Northern Arizona, the Northern Arizona Climate Change Alliance. And our mission is really helping people to understand the science of climate change and empower people to do things about it. We hope that you'll help participate with NASCA. You can always find out more at the website, nazcca.org. As I said, we're a nonprofit, so we also appreciate any donations that anybody wants to make online. So with that, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Stefan Sommer. I'm a mostly retired professor at NAU, Northern Arizona University, in the Department of Biological Sciences. And I'm the Director of Education with the Miriam Powell Center for Environmental Research. So that's really what gives me license to do cool things like this. My background is in the sciences. I did an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, master's degree in pollination ecology at the University of Maryland, and then a doctoral degree started at the University of Arizona and finished up at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque in what we call community ecology. And that doesn't mean human community, that means ecologists who study how all the species in a given ecological community manage to coexist. So that was the focus of the research that I did. And that's really what got me into climate change, because now ecological communities of all sorts are being radically changed by climate change. So let Dr. May introduce himself.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Unlike Stefan, I am totally retired. I'm a United Methodist minister, and I worked for the General Board of Global Ministries for many years in Latin America. So I'm sort of new to this part of the world. I moved to Flagstaff only about 3 years ago, and that's because I have a son and daughter-in-law here. My wife and I lived in Costa Rica for 30 years and elsewhere in Latin America for years before that. And most of my focus has been throughout the years as a professor of theology and ethics. So I spent a lot of time in the classroom, if you will, with students coming from multiple denominations. My institution, the Latin American Biblical University, is very, very open to receive students from almost any kind of background, or Christian background you can think of, but we do have students from time to time who are not Christian, but they study there also. And so I taught theology and ethics there for, as I said, for about 30 years. I've worked on a number of issues through the years, but sort of a connecting theme for my academic work and personal commitment has been the environment. I've been interested and considered myself a conservationist from the time I was a youth. And as I went through my college days and my professional career, questions of the environment have been very, very present. And I've done some work on the issues of faith in the environment. And so that's what makes me interested in the question of climate change and brought me to be a part of NASCA. And that's what puts me here before your screens today. So I look forward to chatting as we can, and above all, listening to comments that all of you will make. We have a very big group, and as Stefan said, it's going to be real hard to really share as we could in a more open face-to-face forum, but at least hopefully we'll be able to share reactions to the video, and Stefan and I will also make some brief comments following, and hopefully this will stimulate a discussion. All of us can go forth to do something about the situation that we're facing.
Again, welcome everybody. So we're gathered in this time of climate change because we're concerned about the effect of climate change on our life support systems. Thank you all very much for being here, part of this important discussion. And thank you all for making this an important part of the discussion in your lives and with your neighbors and with your friends and with your family and everybody you know, because things are not looking good for our immediate future. We need to really gather together and do everything we can about this. I don't know if you've seen the recent projections, but I recently read a study in The Lancet, which is a top medical journal from 2016, that predicted, just based on the changes to agricultural productivity alone, we expect 529,000 human deaths from climate change effects on agriculture by the year 2050. This is coming. It's coming harder and harder. We needed to have acted some years ago, and we really need to act now. The costs of climate change disasters are predicted to go over $50 trillion by 2050 if we can't rein in our emissions now. So these changes that we're facing are very real. I know right now we're meeting via Zoom because of the COVID-19 situation, and it's a dire situation as well, but it's perhaps a small wave relative to the wave that's about to crash on us from climate change. So Roy and I have come together from different perspectives. Roy from the religion perspective and me from the science perspective, but both of us from the human perspective of talking about what are our shared values relative to the effects of climate change and other environmental things on biological diversity, on the biosphere, or on God's creation, whichever you want to call it. So we're going to bring those perspectives together. What are our shared values and what are our shared responsibilities to keep the biosphere or God's creation healthy, to be good stewards of it? So we're going to actually start today's discussion with a brief film that was put together by the Union of Concerned Scientists back in the 90s, a time in which there was a large perception of a rift between science and religion. And so they put this 27-minute film together to try to bridge the gap and show that there are many shared understandings and values, both in the sciences and
in religion. So here it is, Keeping the Earth, Religious and Scientific Perspectives on the Environment. I hope you find this film as inspirational as I do.
In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night. All the life that we have ever known is contained in a thin layer that wraps around the surface of the earth. Its mysteries challenge human comprehension. The search to understand them and their deepest meaning is at the heart of both science and religion. Some call this the creation. Some call this the biosphere. No matter what their perspective, all behold this vision with awe. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth, across the dome of the sky."
We relate to God through God's handiwork. Nature is God's textbook. It's God's gift to existence. So to read God, we read nature.
So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, and every winged bird of every kind. And God said that it was good. And God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good.
The creation, it's something to be deeply valued. It's precious for all of us. And I like to say that it doesn't matter how you view the origin of the creation, you come to the same conclusion. Diversity of life that surrounds us, it's a gift. It's something that was bequeathed to us, and it's something that we bequeath back down onto our descendants.
Let's have the possum next. Then can we have the snake? Then let's have the bush.
Oh, okay.
When the cathedral first announced that there would be a procession of animals to the altar for blessing, there was a great deal of uncertainty, skepticism, curiosity, and doubt as to how it would be received. But when we opened the great 2-ton bronze doors of the cathedral, there were 4,000 silent people in this great sacred space. And we watched an elephant and a camel and a llama, an eagle, a hawk, a pony. And as they all moved down the nave, the length of 2 football fields, people wept. And as nearly as I could understand, people were experiencing a moment of reconciliation. The challenge is for churches and synagogues to open their doors more fully to life itself. Invite life in, the wonder of life, the reverence of life. It doesn't have to be an elephant or a llama coming down the nave to the altar. It just can be a sense that what's out there now belongs in here, inside our congregations and inside our hearts.
So God created humankind. Male and female, God created them. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth."
Human beings are clearly distinct in creation, a strange combination of the dust of the earth and the breath of God. We have a God-given creativity which we can use to improve the world and improve our lives. And at the same time, that creativity, which is our godlikeness, is constantly restricted by our creatureliness, if you will. The idea that even though we're unique in creation, there are absolute limits on human behavior and our choices of how we use God's world.
The human species, where do we fit in the great diversity of life that surrounds us? For thousands of years, the concept of dominion has been an important theme in religious thought.
The scriptural view is dominion does not mean abusive use. It means earth keeping. It means creature keeping. If we decide to take charge, which we have as human beings on earth, then we, as good stewards of the creation, are obligated not to destroy that over which we have been given dominion. So this dominion really is service. It's the same sort of thing that's reflected in Genesis 2:15. Adam is asked to serve the garden.
And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to serve it and to keep it.
Adam is asked to serve the garden. That's a really interesting concept, because what comes out of that is that recognition that the garden, or the creation more broadly, serves us, serves all other creatures with the fruits of creation. But we also serve it, and so there's a kind of conservice, or a conservancy, or a conservation.
The command is a basic command. It's the first command, to keep the garden and to care for it. And I think that we have to understand that. I mean, it's elemental. I mean, it's there in Genesis before you get the Ten Commandments. Caring for the creation is a fundamental call that the Lord places upon us all.
Our relationship to the earth is also a subject of profound interest to scientists.
Humanity, we were created here, we evolved here. This is our home to which we are adapted in exquisite detail. That means that the levels of oxygen that we breathe, the humidity, the temperature, all things maintained in equilibrium. It's a pretty steady state by all these millions of organisms in the midst of which we live, is exactly what our bodies need. In other words, we have a superb environment, beautifully adapted to us now. We should be attempting to conserve it for our own good.
As we better understand how the biosphere protects us, we are realizing that instead of protecting it, we have been altering it at an ever-accelerating pace.
This is the first time in the history of people on Earth that we are having a tremendous impact on the entire biosphere of the Earth. We're beginning to appreciate the magnitude of that influence. Never before have we had as many people on Earth. Never before has the use of the resources, the biological resources of the planet been as great as it is now. And the impact that we are having is absolutely astounding and, frankly, quite frightening.
We could lose as many as 20% of the species of plants and animals on Earth, particularly on the land surface where most of the damage is occurring right now, in the next 30 years or so, if we don't take stronger measures. The only way to save the rest of life is through the preservation of natural environment. habitats, reserves.
What we need is a much broader recognition of the problems that careless human activities are bringing upon us. A realization that we can not be rescued by science and technology because these problems at their root are human problems and have to be dealt with as such. And it's clear to the scientific community that this is the case.
Thanks to our scientific understandings, we know now what we didn't know before. We know the damage we're causing, and we know the consequences of our actions. And I think that changes the situation greatly in terms of the ethical nature of the dilemmas we're facing.
We really have to save the creation, and we have to save the planet. And we can only do that if we feel that it is a unitary goal, that we all have something at stake here.
I think we have to look deeper in our hearts, if you like. This is a problem of values. It's not a problem of techniques or approaches or science. It's a question of values. It's a moral and ethical challenge as to how we, this living generation, treats the environment that we so critically depend on.
I think that this issue, more than any other issue, has the potential to overcome race, class, gender, whatever divisions that are, plaguing our society, that we can come together on this.
I think the articulation of the environmental crisis has made me think a lot more deeply about what is the biblical vision of humanity's position in the world and in the cosmos. And I think that the biblical material has a great deal to say on this subject.
And God said to Noah, "Make yourself an ark, for behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth. You shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you."
The first Endangered Species Act is where Noah is asked by the Creator to take 2 of every kind and preserve their lineages. And it's interesting that the cost of this Endangered Species Act is immense. Noah spends perhaps something like 100 years, immense resources, very valuable wood, a great deal of time, and then perhaps the most devastating of all to most of us would be the derision that one would get if one would spend 100 years building a very large boat on absolutely dry land. But the result is that he is the one who is faithful in preserving the species, in preserving their line, and the rest of the people perish from the earth.
And God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature. I so set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of the covenant between me and the earth."
The covenant is with all life, with every creature. And of course, what this means is that as we look at the rainbow, what we're supposed to do, according to biblical teaching, is to remember that every species, all the things that have been preserved from that deluge in the past, are worthy of our effort of preservation today.
The covenant that we hold is a covenant that's a covenant with God for the whole of creation, human and non-human, and that in this present crisis, religion reminds us and holds us accountable to that kind of responsibility for all God has made.
In in a certain sense, we conduct a continuing conversation with God as we move through God's creation in the natural world. If that's true somehow, every act which destroys a species circumscribes our conversation with our Creator. The destruction of a species of God's creation is, metaphorically, like tearing a page out of Scripture.
When you're looking at the planet from outer space, you see lights at night. You see clusters of lights in the large cities. The planet isn't dark from outer space. It is dotted with lights. Well, that is the human presence. How many lights can the planet tolerate is a question that runs through my mind. If we succeed in lighting up the planet at night, will we have done good for the Earth, or will we have destroyed it?
Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work done in creation.
You know, rather than working and changing and creating unceasingly, the Sabbath teaches us to say enough. It teaches us to stop creating and changing and doing, but to really appreciate and sanctify the world as it is. Another aspect of the Sabbath is that the land has a Sabbath of its own.
When you enter the land I'm going to give you, the land itself must observe a Sabbath to the Lord. In the seventh year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land.
One of the things that we are asked to do in the Scriptures is not relentlessly press creation. That is done through the teaching of the Sabbath not only for human beings, but also the Sabbath for the land. If we relentlessly press the land, then what we do is to interfere with the capacity of the land to restore and rejuvenate itself. If we do that, we begin to erode the very home upon which human life depends.
As human pressure on the natural world increases, scientists warn about the long-term effects.
I think that it's very difficult to know where the limits are. Oftentimes you don't know it until it's too late. I think that we as humanity need to do something different than just say to scientists, help us understand where the limits are, which is appropriate. But I think that it's also a social issue and a social and moral question that involves how we view this world that we're using and what the limits are.
If we're really honest about our own lives, we have not only violated the Sabbath for the earth, but we also have violated the Sabbath for ourselves. We have gotten on what we call the treadmill, the rat race. We spend a lot of time racing around And there's a necessary first step, and that is we have to scale back in some of our frenzied activity to the point where we can reflect on who we are, why we're here, and where we're going.
If our descendants come to realize that in a couple of generations we have destroyed a large part of the creation by carelessly extinguishing species and allowing species to grow extinct, they are going to consider us a ship of fools. They're going to consider us as being one of the most destructive generations of all time in terms of what matters the most to them.
I think there's a growing movement that is accepting this moral responsibility and saying, things aren't right. This is not the way it's supposed to be. What do we do about it? And that's where I see a partnership between science and religion serving a very powerful, very, very important role.
We are called to be stewards of the earth, and that is part of my faith commitment, is part of my faith journey, that this must be an important part of it, that I must take it very seriously. That as we are called to keep the garden, that we understand that, and that I pass that around, that it's not just becomes part of my faith journey, that I become a missionary for the planet.
There are many levels on which these set of challenges, this great thicket of difficulties has to be met. On the individual level, where people realize and accept changes, not necessarily damaging changes, but just a more careful use of resources, recycling, supporting others in recycling, and so forth. But also at a larger national, international level, there has to be support for changes in the way governments approach these problems. And the support starts at the grassroots.
The most important thing in stewardship really is that we be able to make our institutions work to be stewards. We can't just think of ourselves in this society as just individual actors. Our action is always through institutions, and by and large is through institutions that will make a new future.
I think we need to remember that everything is a piece of a puzzle, including us, and it's not ours to pull apart. There's a prayer that I love that we say every Sabbath. It says that even if our own mouths were as full of song as the sea, and our lips as full of praise as the breaths of the heaven, and our eyes as bright as the sun, and our hands as outstretched as the eagles of the sky, and our feet as swift as gazelles, we could not thank you enough. And I think there's an important lesson in that. In some way, all of creation praises God, and every voice in that chorus is needed.
Both science and religion call upon us to keep the earth. All of our voices are needed.
So welcome back, everybody. And Roy's going to say a few words just to start us into the discussion part.
All right. Well, hope everybody enjoyed the video. Certainly, I imagine we're in full agreement that the voice of James Earl Jones is indeed divine. That may be the only thing we're in agreement on, but he's certainly a wonderful narrator. The background to the production of this video, as Stefan said, is the question of the relationship between science and religion. I'd like to say just some brief words about that, and then a couple of other comments that might be helpful as we think about the relationship of people of faith to environmental questions. Of course, the relationship between science and religion has often been conflictive, and it continues to be conflictive for many people today. But if we begin to think about what is science and what is religion, I think we can understand that we really are talking about two different things, both of which are very important, but different ways of understanding the world that ask different questions about the world. Science asks the questions about material reality, how it functions, how it came about, how it is affected in itself. It looks for explanations for the empirical world and universe in which we live. Whereas religion, and when I say religion, I can understand it broadly, but since I'm a Christian theologian, I work from my own faith tradition, but religion asks the question of meaning, of values, of what is good, what is bad. It asks questions about what is our purpose and how, as human beings, we should live in relationship to each other and to the empirical reality that scientists study. So we really have sort of two different kinds of truth. Both are vital for understanding and living in the world, but they are different. And so as a Christian theologian, I do not have the means, if you will, to determine how the natural world exists. I'm not a scientist on that, although I rely on scientists to help me understand. In the same sense, a scientist cannot say if something is good or bad. Stefan quoted the recent article from the medical journal The Lancet about what global warming might mean in terms of human survival and the number of people that can die as climate changes and makes food production impossible and what have you. But as a scientist, you can't say whether that's good or bad. Simply can say that's what's going to happen. It's the question of whether or not that's good or bad, acceptable, whether we want that. That's the kind of thing that religion is going to be looking at. Same way with the question of COVID-19. It makes us work through Zoom. That is, it is tragic how it is affecting the lives of people and literally taking thousands and thousands of lives. Science is telling us how this comes about. Science is telling us what we can do about it. But it is a question of values as to what we think about this, whether this is good or bad. And so you have the interplay of religion and science there, but they ask two different kinds of questions, both of which are vital to living well in the world. So we have to understand that there's more than one kind of truth, if you will, and we need each other to begin to ferret out and discover what those truths are as we all try to live together. But a second thing which I'd like to comment on is that many people, I think, even people coming from their own faith traditions, and certainly, as I know all too well, people coming from the Christian tradition, do not understand that within their own tradition, there are many rich resources for a faith response to environmental questions and the questions of climate change. Many times we seem to think that, well, no, we're just concerned about sort of the sweet by and by, and there's nothing that anchors us to the material world, if you will. Or we will say there's not a whole lot within our tradition that teaches in the theme of this program of a commitment to caring for the natural order. That simply is a mistake. There are many, many rich resources within, in the case of Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, which I know best, about caring for the earth. Many of these were alluded to in the video, but the idea that the earth, for instance, belongs to God, it doesn't belong to people, that it is that the earth, the land, the soil is given as a gift, or as the Hebrew Bible says, as an inheritance. And as an inheritance, there are controls over the way in which we, as the receivers of that inheritance, can use the earth. We're not allowed to use it in any way. And the Hebrew tradition, you can't even sell it. There is no such thing as private property within the ancient Hebrew tradition. There are controls over how you use the land, environmental controls. You think in terms of the famous chapter in Leviticus 25, the Jubilee chapters, where it talks about very specifically about the care for the land. And you find that in other texts within the ancient Hebrew traditions also. Or you begin to look at then some of the wisdom writings, particularly the Psalms, like Psalm 104, where nature is seen as the very house of God, or God's clothing. That is, there is an intimate relationship. And of course, the allusion in the video that we're called to be keepers of the earth. That's the word that in the English translation, at least, that Adam is given the responsibility to keep the earth, care for, and to bring forth from the earth. So we have a lot of that within that ancient tradition. And if you move over to the specifically Christian tradition within the New Testament, certainly there are ways of talking about the life of Jesus in relationship to nature. But if you look at, for instance, some of the scriptures that come out of the Gospel of John, for example, in the prologue, in the beginning was the Word, and then you pick up in some of the Pauline writings, particularly the pseudo-Pauline writings, where the idea of Christ is a cosmic presence. So we talk about the cosmic Christ, the Christ that is present in the whole of the universe. All of those come together as very rich resources as we, as people of faith, particularly from the Judeo-Christian tradition at least, look at our responsibility as we're faced with environmental crisis and certainly with the question of global climate change. Thirdly then, to follow up on that, and with this I'll close, global climate change, as well as other environmental questions, bring to fore very real questions of social justice. Global climate change, just like COVID-19, affects everybody. But the fact is, it affects some people more than others and more quickly than others. And the ones that are most affected are those who are the most vulnerable, those who are in the lowest economic echelons. COVID-19 shows very clearly that people of color and people of the lowest economic brackets are those that are suffering disproportionately. That is injustice. Same way with climate change and environmental questions. Those that suffer first and those who suffer most, those who are in the least position to do something about it. So this raises very serious questions of justice. And for those of us, at least, who come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, that is fundamental bedrock requirement that as people of faith, we're called to respond and correct those kinds of injustices. So I think all of these were alluded to in the video, but simply I think as we think about this, it's important to remember then that this conflict between science and religion is a pseudo-conflict. We are interested in both because both have different kinds of truths and we need both of those truths. We ask different questions. We need to ask both of those questions and we need to join together to have a conversation about our answers to have a better, more healthy world in which to live. That there clearly are resources within our faith tradition that we can draw upon and that we're called to look at the question of justice and to do something about it. But those are some of my feelings, at least, as I have looked at this video and have worked on these issues through the years and put them forth for your discussion and your comments. And I'll turn it over to the scientist, Stefan, whom I might say, and as you can discover very clearly, just as I, as a theologian, can be very interested in science, Stefan, as a scientist, has deep values that he brings to this also. And in him, I think we can see what I am talking about, of bringing together science and religion. Is that okay, Stefan? To form value assumptions around the science that he knows so well.
Well, thank you very much, Roy. And again, thank you everybody for being here with us. Science doesn't tend to work in the realm of values so much. We work in the realm of data, but certainly we also work from the human perspective, and values are very important. So the film was made by the Union of Concerned Scientists in 1996. And at that time, we already had a large biodiversity crisis because of things that fall under the acronym of HIPPO. H stands for habitat destruction, the I for introduced species, the first P for pollution, the second for human population, and then the final overconsumption. So those were already affecting God's creation, biological diversity, in pretty intense ways, and we were already going through a mass extinction at that time. Since that time, of course, climate change has now been the multiplier for all of those different effects on God's creation, on biological diversity. And the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, keeps track of threatened and endangered species, and they list 31,000 species threatened with extinction today. And of course, that's a little bit of an underestimate, because we're still classifying species, we're still discovering species. And so of the 161,000 species that they had been able to assess out of the tens of millions of species that exist, 31,000 are threatened with extinction. And that's all different kinds of parts of the creation. You may have heard of the bug apocalypse. We're seeing in some parts of the world, 75% of insect populations are gone. For vertebrates that are tracked by the World Wildlife Fund, as reported in the Living Planet Report of 2018, overall, globally, 60% decline in vertebrate populations across the entire globe. So that's huge. And if you look, you can break that down across the different parts of the globe. In the neotropical parts of the world, 83% decline in vertebrate populations. In the afrotropical parts of the world, 56% decline in vertebrate populations. And in the Indo-Pacific, 64% decline in vertebrate populations. And this is of about 17,000 populations of 4,005 different species have seen this kind of decline. So this is a massive survey of species and their populations, and they're seeing huge declines. Globally, 83% decline in all freshwater vertebrates. So the effects on biodiversity are getting more and more extreme. It's not just our life support systems, but the entire creation. And I think we have a responsibility in terms of stewardship, in terms of preserving our own life support systems, but beyond that, there's a value in that creation. There's a value in those species beyond just their ability to support human life. So with that, I'd really like to open it up to questions and comments from y'all. And John McCartney is here with us today. He's helping out by voicing those things that you put into the chat box. Please help John by making your comments and questions as succinct and clear as possible so that he can voice them to either myself or to Roy or to both of us as you desire. So John, go ahead. Please bring those things forward to us.
Hi, everybody. Ron Brinkman has something here. Human population and its growth is the greatest contributor to greenhouse gases and climate change. Please discuss the policies and responsibilities clergy, faith leaders have to promote family planning. Faith leaders may have more influence on population growth than our political leaders.
Let's see, we're supposed to respond to this.
Yes.
Well, it's obviously very, very broad what you're saying, and there are many questions that are that are involved in this, particularly when we talk about population is varied. There are great differences in the capacity of different human groups to consume. Some groups consume far more than others. Some hardly consume at all. So the question of population has to be understood in historical context in terms of the kinds of elements that I just mentioned. Certainly, it is a question that has to be dealt with, and I think faith leaders, and this will differ from traditions, have a very real responsibility to work with future parents to help them understand what responsible parenting means. And that may well mean, and many times certainly would, limiting perhaps the size of their family. But I have done pastoral work over the years, although, as I said, I've mostly done academic work, although I taught a lot of these issues. So this is certainly part of courses that I talked about. It is important to help prospective parents understand that parenting is not just a personal kind of thing for them, but parenting has implications for the broader society. And so to help future parents think through what it means to be parents and what kind of families they want to have, I think is a vital part of Christian ministry.
Yeah, and from a scientific perspective, yes, population is the underlying issue. Even if we all minimize our footprint, our carbon footprints, to as small as we can make them, you take those small carbon footprints and you multiply by 7.8 billion, and it still is a large carbon footprint. So yes, we need to change our consumption patterns and a variety of things, and there needs to be fewer of us doing all of those things. So the other side of it is that biologically we're programmed to procreate. So it's very difficult, both evolutionarily and socially, to keep people from having kids. And I have enjoyed having children and now enjoy having grandchildren. So I understand the pressure and the desire to have children. At the same time, we do need to reduce our extreme exponential population growth that's going on today. Next question, John.
Okay, it says, please comment on Pope Francis's encyclical and its importance for faith and science.
Well, we can talk about that. Also, John, I see another questions coming up about religious groups speaking out on these issues. So those two kind of go together. Yeah, I can respond to that first. First of all, many religious groups, certainly within the Christian and Jewish traditions, for a number of years now, important church and synagogue groups have spoken very directly to the question, going back 20 years or more. Important declarations, particularly in the Christian tradition, what we call the historic or mainline traditions, like Presbyterian USA or United Methodist, which is my own tradition. Lutherans, Episcopalians have spoken out many times, and they have very strong programs even today. So they have been very, very active on this. Of course, not all local congregations pick up on it. That's a problem. But the denominations have been, and you look at the world scene, the World Council of Churches, for instance, has a full-time program on environment and climate change, which they try to work with churches throughout the world. And certainly a major contribution is that of Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which is his, well, more or less, probably about 5 years ago now, his encyclical on the environment that placed the Roman Catholic Church very squarely in the center of expressing environmental concern and putting the Roman Catholic Church, or committing the Roman Catholic Church to being very much a part of the struggle for a saner, healthier environment. So yeah, the churches are doing and have done some very good things in it. But as I said, unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean that all local congregations are doing it. And when you talk about the Christian religion, you're talking about a huge hodgepodge of differing ways of understanding the Christian faith. And so some of these concerns are not necessarily shared by all Christian groups.
So I have a comment from Hazel Bowman, maybe for Stefan. I know people who are firmly in denial that humans contribute to global warming and or state that there has always been climate change. No matter what scientific evidence with supporting links I present, they don't accept it. What can we do for these individuals in understanding the gravity of what Mother Earth is experiencing?
Very good point, Hazel. And it's difficult sometimes to reach people with new ways of thinking about things because we gather our own evidence, we make our own conclusions, and then if somebody tries to counter those, sometimes we resist. So I guess the best advice I can give is that if you're talking to somebody whom you know, you have a sense of what values they have and what stories they know and enjoy, and you can try to connect to the things that they know. There's no question that current climate change is caused 100% by human activities. That analysis was done first by the scientific community in 1992, at which time we concluded that current climate change is caused by us. Since that time, all the other analyses have pointed to the same thing. There's just not a question anymore in the scientific community, and there hasn't been for a long, long time. You'll hear other things that are political or paid for by the dinosaur technologies and fossil fuel industries because they want to hold on to their control of the profit system. And so they don't want us to move in new directions with new technologies. In any case, though, to connect to people, find their values, link to those values, and help them understand. And if you need the data on any of that, just let me know, and I'm happy to share it with you, either through a presentation or just sending it to you to use.
I have a good comment from Steve Keplinger. He says, I realize the film was made in 1996, but I'm hoping we can move beyond the language of human stewardship. It continues to suggest a hierarchical relationship with the rest of the planet. I can't change anything without understanding of our relationship with the planet. Caretaking and kinship language is vital in making this change.
Well, I think that's exactly right. That caretaking and kinship is really what we're talking about. We can talk about a lot, the whole discussion of stewardship. There's no question that the term stewardship emerged in a feudal order, but over the years it's also lost that sense. And I think that for stewardship, for most people, has a very, very positive thing. But that's another whole debate that I worked on at one time or another. I think what you look at, what you're saying, is the idea of caring and kinship. And if you look particularly the second creation story, that is the story of Adam and Eve, which is also mentioned in the video, is, I think, the one of the strongest texts for talking about, in quotation marks, stewardship, because what it talks about really is caring and kinship. So if we want to do away with the word stewardship, you can. Stewardship is not a word that's even a biblical word. It's not in the Bible, or at least it's not as a theological word other than a reference to stewards. What we see in that second Genesis creation story is a kind of symbiotic relationship between Adam and the soil. Even Adam and, which means soil, Adam and all of the animals, for instance, are all created from the soil, from the earth. And so there is an organic relationship there from the beginning. And so Adam is, in this ancient myth, is put in the garden to, as we said, keep it, care for it, cultivate it. Cultivate it today sounds like something we do to the soil, but cultivation in its origin, the word means to bring forth, and it is a mutual relationship. And a lot of that's been lost. But I think that when we talk about the relationship to the earth as keepers of the earth, perhaps using the word stewards of the earth, but what we want to do is exactly what you're saying, looking at kinship and a caring relationship. And I think Adam offers that kind of model. If you want a contemporary model for Adam, I think we can look at the Hopi farmers. You look at traditional farmers and look at Hopis that are not far from us and see the way in which they care for the cultivations, if you will. That's a very close relationship. Someone suggested, I saw a comment that we needed to be closer to the indigenous ways. If you look at the ancient Hebrew tradition, you're talking about what today we call indigenous farming and indigenous relationship to the land. Unfortunately, that's been lost, but it's there within our tradition.
I take your point about, who are we to say we're in charge? But as they point out in the film, our species has taken charge. Through our numbers and our technologies and everything, we have taken charge of the planet. And so we really do need to connect to the idea of stewardship, and that we just can't willy-nilly rip God's creation apart. We need to care for it because it's what cares for us. Above and beyond that, it has its own right to exist, as I mentioned earlier.
I have a question. Actually, two people are bringing up the same subject. Eric Nolan and Sarah King speak about, here's Sarah's comment. One of the last 2 points made in the movie was the importance of changing our institutions, our governments, to become more environmentally conscious. Please discuss the responsibility of our religious leaders to speak truth to power in local and national governments regarding the need for this transformation. Too often, religious leaders shrink from taking what they see as political stances when it comes to the environment.
Well, that's certainly true. I think in many, many instances, the way in which I understand the teachings of what I would call the Judeo-Christian tradition, the representatives of that faith, whether they be the clergy, whether they be rabbi, or whether they be lay, are called upon to lift the prophetic voice before the environmental and global change questions that we're raising. The point I wanted to make when I talk about the importance of justice issues. Although a lot of things have changed in the years, clergy still carry a great deal of moral authority. And that moral authority is important to be heard in the public sphere. I am not one that thinks that clergy and the church should take over political power, but I certainly think that from our faith traditions, we should raise the prophetic voice. And I think that church leaders and, as I say, synagogue leaders and laypersons, or all of us, are responsible to do that.
It's a good comment, and the scientists have the same responsibility. So we know and have known for some time what's coming, and we've not been very effective as a group, scientists, in communicating that to the general public or to our elected leaders. So we need to become more effective in that, both of those things. And some of us are working on it. I don't know what level of success we've had so far, but there are some of us who are beginning to work on this.
Here's a comment from Jesse Rodriguez. I found this statement interesting from the video. We cannot be rescued by science and technology because these problems at the root are human problems. So example, Tesla, yes, they are electric cars, but the materials needed to create them, like the metals, are coming from environmentally destructive mines. So even if we push towards a cleaner economy, we won't get to the underlying issue of us demanding more and more, resulting in more energy to produce. Would the golden answer be going anti-capitalism?
I think it's exactly right that the answers are not going to be technological and scientific. They can help us a lot. They can do an awful lot. But in my perspective, and as I think what was said in the video, finally we're talking about human values. What we as humans consider to be important. And we need to do an awful lot of thinking about that. However, that does involve the question of how we understand economics, and in that case, how we understand capitalism, because that is the economic order that we have. And there is much to criticize in terms of the way in which we understand economics. And many of our values of what we consider to be important about things that we need or don't need is taught to us, if you will, by the kind of economic framework that we have. And one of the very difficult parts about this is that, we've mentioned several times, and it comes up, consumerism, for example. But our entire economic system is based upon consuming. Look at what is happening now with COVID-19, when industries, stores, restaurants have been forced to close down. There isn't consumption, and look at our situation. So yes, these are questions that do involve how we understand economic order and how we organize and put that together. And capitalism is what we have, and therefore we need to look at that very, very closely to see how, or even if it should function as it does.
Yes, as Roy is saying, our whole economic system is based on growth. And there are many people who are working on steady state economies and other alternative ways to structure our society. I'm not really an economist, but we should be paying close attention to that so that we can rein in our overconsumption and our overuse of resources. Now, shifting to alternative technologies is going to require use of resources. None of these things that we plan to replace the full fossil fuel industry with are free of consumption, but we need to, as we have with COVID, rapidly shift the way in which we consume so that we do it as little as possible and with the least impact possible. We need to really create a culture of sustainability in which everybody is constantly figuring out how to minimize their footprint, both their carbon footprints and their ecological footprints, and do the things that they do in the least impactful way. There's a vast amount of stuff that we could talk about there, but that's the general short answer.
I have another statement and question here from Aaron Stone. Do you feel that the desire to tackle climate change is a moral issue, is a growing movement within Christian communities? In other words, what responsibility do you feel, if any, faith communities have to stand up to some of the louder faith groups who are pushing anti-science rhetoric and policy?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's necessarily for us my faith group to attack another faith group, but what it is incumbent upon us is from our faith perspective to raise the prophetic voice, independent of what perhaps other faith groups might say or differ from us. And so I certainly think that we do have that responsibility. And yes, in my perspective, I think it is a deeply moral question that we're dealing with. The destruction of the natural order, moral issue, not only in terms of what it does to humanity, and particularly to if you will, the least of humanity, the most vulnerable. It's what we're doing to the whole order that as Christians and Jews we understand has been created by God, and that's the whole of creation is not ours to do with as we please, but to do with as we have been given the responsibility to care and to understand our kinship with. That may be different from other faith groups, Christian or other, but certainly those of us that understand that, I think, have a responsibility to make that very clear in the public arena.
And I would agree. I think it's not just a moral issue, but it's an existential one at this point. We need to come to grips with this, and we need to do it really quickly, or it threatens our very existence.
Well, that is a moral issue.
It's a moral issue.
You're right.
The existential part of moral, I guess.
Steph and Sarah King would love to see another one of these presentations on how to shift to the kind of economy that you're talking about.
Now, Stefan can do that.
I do have some presentations that are about climate change and building a path forward, in which I review some of the plans that people have put together for how we can quickly rein in our emissions to reach the net zero goals by 2050. Some folks by 2040. The city of Flagstaff here, our city council has already passed a climate action and adaptation plan that sets the goal for the city of Flagstaff for the entire city to be net zero by 2040. And now folks have more recently been calling for reaching that by 2030, because really to attain the net zero goals of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we need to do it that rapidly. So in any case, there are lots of people who are working on it, and I do make a presentation that covers some of those efforts. So looking at the NASCA website for announcement, become a NASCA member, then you get announcements of all those presentations.
Jim Gale wants to know how we can continue these conversations. How can we collaborate to reinforce a moral necessity to protect all life?
Well, we can connect Zoom most any time.
Well, so Jim, this is really that kind of effort. So this is an attempt to bring us all together to have these kinds of conversations. We need to keep working on this. We had 77 folks register for this forum today, and it's really good to see how many folks have come out for it. So it's a start. We need to keep doing this as much as we can. And, and we all need to become advocates for these things with our friends and families and neighbors and within our faith communities.
Pamela Hyde says, how can scientists help religious faith leaders strengthen their message that we are all a part of God's creation? How do we as faith leaders describe the interconnectedness of all life, the web of life, in a way that reaches hearts? Are there other scientific concepts that have the power to illuminate our relationship to creation for people?
Well, I don't know. I guess either one of us could respond to that. Let me just say, in terms of my own personal pilgrimage in all of this, is that I have found, like many others like me, that the field of ecology, as it has emerged, has been extremely helpful in understanding the interconnectedness of all of life. And as I have understood that from the strictly religious or Christian tradition in terms of the interrelatedness of life, from we found in Genesis all through Paul, who talks so much about our being in community with one another, the koinonia, and the need for each other, the teachings of Jesus as we are connected and called to reach out for each other. The science of ecology has given an empirical basis, if you will, for that, to help us understand that it's not just sort of a spiritual concept, but indeed a very material concept, that we are indeed related and that we need each other, and that the kind of environment that we find ourselves in has something to do with the quality of those relationships. Now, I may talk about that in terms of human communities vis-a-vis nature and what have you. Stefan may talk about that in terms of nature. We have something in common there because we're interested in the whole sense of what it means to be community and interrelated, both with other humans as well as other forms of life.
And for me, as a scientist studying ecological communities, nature is incredibly beautiful and, if you will, miraculous in the complexity of the interactions between species and the ways in which they build healthy ecological communities. It's just amazing how much adaptation and detailed organization there is behind those ecological communities. And we're now, we should see the miracle in that intense, co-evolved set of systems. The more you learn about it, the more you realize just how complex they are and how little we understand. And so we're ripping apart these systems now before we can fully understand them. And in my world, as a scientist trying to understand these things, it's a sin. We should not be tearing these things apart. And I don't usually talk in terms of sin, but in my world, as sin goes, that's really one of the key ones.
Like I say, scientists have values. You won't put that in your scientific article, but you're very right. We fully agree. Good. We have more comments?
How are we doing, John?
People are mainly saying thank you, great conversation. I'm wondering, and in the comments, there's a lot of good information that people might want. Comments that weren't fully voiced, or recommendations for other writings, and maybe some videos in there too, but some really good thoughts are in there. I don't know if you want to share any of those with the group, but
well, there probably are a lot of resources. We'd have to put them together, but I noted early on there was a comment. In my comments, I referred to the Pseudo-Pauline writings and the Cosmic Christ, and somebody asked, I don't remember now because I don't see it there. Let me just say that in the New Testament, some of the writings that are attributed to St. Paul were not written by St. Paul, although they carry his name. They were written by followers of St. Paul. So we have sort of two sets. We have the writings that we know are written by St. Paul, and we have some of the writings that were not written by St. Paul, but carry the same kind of theology. But you look at some of the pseudo ones, you find emphasis on aspects of the cosmic Christ, for instance, in Ephesians and also in Hebrews, and certainly in Colossians 1:15-12, for instance, or 3:11, talk a lot about the cosmic Christ. And some of the Pauline writings in Corinthians talk about Christ is overall. In Christ, all things come together. And then, of course, which I mentioned particularly also, the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word. And so that has been interpreted as, they say, the Christ presence in the whole of the universe. So that's the material that I was referring to. It's very, very brief, and all of this merits a great deal more discussion. But I did want to answer that question.
Well, again, thank you all very much for having the concern to come out and join this conversation. We need to build community around this, and this is one way to do it. I wish we could be doing this in person. When Roy and I have done this in person, we've had very rich conversations, and everybody's been able to join the discussion in a much more fluid way than we are able to do here via Zoom. But I think this is really important work, and this is just a start. We need to build from here. So thank you all very much for coming out. If you have any final questions, please put them forth, and we'll do our best to answer them. But if you need to go, we have passed our time. So thank you all again for joining in. Yeah, so for the remaining folks, we could open it up to a verbal discussion if you all are interested in putting forth your questions directly to us.
This is Pat. I'll just say one thing that was in my mind. Information about population and consumption has been really a point of discussion and debate for decades. And it's been my feeling through that time period that both are playing a role. But when I look at parts of the world where consumption is low, then I think, well, there's population growth there, but the consumption is not nearly what it is here in the United States, where our birth rate is low. So I'm sort of betwixt and between on those points of discussion. I'd be interested to hear what others might think about it.
Very, very good points. The way I look at it, we need to rein in our consumption and our population growth, and we all need to be doing it together. Some folks, in the less developed countries are saying, you guys consumed all this stuff and you guys had the benefit of all of that, and now you want to rein us in before we get to do the same. Unfortunately, we've pushed ourselves so far into a corner that we will get to that point of over $50 trillion a year in climate disaster costs if we don't all just join in it and make it an entire global group effort.
It is a very interesting question on that. And I think, children are born for lots of reasons. Some are more healthy reasons than others. But we know that birthing has to do with the status of women, for example. It has to do with women's status in society in terms of educational levels. This is overall, certainly each individual will be different. Women with higher or more years of education tend to have fewer children overall. There are societies of which the status of women is still primarily to be reproducers. So you have all of those kinds of cultural things, but you also have economic questions. A lot of times, poor people are criticized, I was in Latin America for 40 years. So there's a lot of criticism about why poor Latin Americans have a lot of children. One, they may not have the economic means to get contraceptives, for example, or they may not have the information to do that. But there are important economic reasons. Children, for poor people, are not necessarily an economic drain. It seems like that to me as a middle-class person, but not to them. I have 2 sons, both now adults. My 2 sons cost me an absolute fortune, raising them, sending them to college. Oh, they've never paid me back 1 cent. Now, as I'm getting old, I'm going to count on them to take care of me. But monetarily, they've been a drain, if you will. But children of poor people in Latin America, they are a source of income. They go to the streets, they beg, they do little jobs. You can put them to work, and they provide income for the family. So when we talk about population, there are a host of things that we have to talk about. And so in my perspective, it's very easy to talk about in the aggregate, there are too many people. Yes, but then we need to break that down and look at where, why, how, and then begin to look at policies that more adequately correspond to what we want as the reduction of an overall population. So in that sense, I find it to be a very, very complicated question.
And Pat, overall, we need to do more in countries like the United States because our footprints are just so far above and beyond everybody else's. So we've got a bigger job here than folks in some of the other countries. But again, I think we all need to be working on it.
One of the things that wasn't talked about, and it wasn't directly in this, but is the photos that we've seen of the world and of cities and the change of pollution during this sequestration of people, slowing us down, keeping us off the road, out of our automobiles. We can start to see things, and people in cities can actually at times see the stars at night. So how we can translate this into the future when everybody starts moving around again, if we relate the pollution coming up to human activity and how we can modify that. Public transportation, one possible source, and just cutting down our consumption on it.
Well, Gene, you're hitting the nail on the head. We've shown with COVID-19 just how much we can change overnight. Now, the reduction in carbon footprint still is not really showing up on the global scale. It's showing up on the city and regional scale in some cases, but it's shown us that we can make these changes. And so we know it's possible. And so rather than when COVID-19 is done, once we have the vaccine in hand, we shouldn't be seeking to go back to business as usual. We should currently be establishing new patterns that have lower footprints and carrying those into the future. You know, and we can all do that on an individual basis, but we also need to begin to do it on a collective basis. We need to make the bigger shifts that we can make as a society above and beyond what we can do as individuals as well. Any other questions, John? In terms of population, education of women has been the most effective approach. We've tried educating the men, it just doesn't work. So when we educate women, not in terms of family planning education, but in terms of education that gives them economic security, that allows them to be certain of their futures, then they no longer rely on large numbers of children and grandchildren to support them in old age. And, you know, there's a whole set of connected things. So education of women has been one of the most effective approaches to population.
John Yazzie has a really nice comment here. John says, my impression is that to address global warming, you have to address the question of what is the purpose of life, then that would address how natural resources are used to allow communities to function. In the example of the Hopi by R.H. May and Getting Back to the Land, the centrality of life is focused on the community of the village. The purpose of life will define to what standards we live our life and how we interact with the other circles of life and how they will reciprocate back to the life cycle of man. I like that.
Very well put.
I made that comment. Yeah, I brought that question up because the like Navajo teachings, they're based on the 4 sacred mountains, but the 4 sacred mountains form what they call the sacred Hogan. But inside the sacred Hogan, for which all the teachings are to be applied, is the individual, the family, community, society, and the natural resources. And yes, man has one circle of life, but our circle of life interacts with the other circles of life, whether it be air, oxygen, water, animals, insects. They're all interconnected. And I always tell people, you know, think of the hoop dancer. You know, he starts with one hoop, he masters a skill of his, you know, living his circle of life, and then he starts interacting other circles of life. And then, you know, eventually he learns to juggle all this stuff. But that's just skills. It's, you know, it's trying to orient your belief system to say, you know, what skills do I need to apply in order to develop a better person and a better society and community, and so that we can all live with each other and to interact with the resources.
I think it's very powerful. I think one of the things that we need too on this is that you just gave an indigenous perspective on this. I mean, I don't come from that belief system, but I think there's a lot of contact between what you just said and what I can draw from my own tradition. And we can keep our traditions, but I think there's a lot there that there's a lot of coming togetherness in spite of the difference in sound when we talk about these things. But the meanings, I think, can have a lot of correspondence. And I think that one of the things we need is much more of this kind of, if you will, inter-religious or intercultural dialogue from our own traditions to look at what Stefan was talking about when he sent out the invitation. What are our common concerns, our common values? Where do we come together? So listening to you, I think we could do a lot of coming together, although we are quite different, if you will.
So, John, I thank you very much for your comments. I didn't really share my own faith traditions with everybody so far, but I should introduce myself in the more Navajo kind of way and say that I'm from the Swabian tribe in southern Germany. You've probably heard of the other southern German tribe, the Bavarians. We're the other guys, we're the Swabians. So we make the Porsche and the Mercedes, and the Bavarians, they make the BMW. So we never let them pass us on the Autobahn. But basically, even though that's my cultural background, in 1970, my dad dropped out to learn from a Paiute medicine man. And so from 6th grade on, I hung out with a bunch of old Paiutes around the sweat lodge every Sunday. And that's where I got my values and my understanding of how important it is to understand how the world works around you. And that's why I went off to Berkeley to get a degree in ecology, because my dedication in life for my coming of age fast was to improve the relationship between the humans and the rest of the world. So when I say my part out in the forest, I always talk about taking care of my family, my friends, and all my relations. And I got that from Raymond Stone, the medicine man. And by all my relations, he didn't just mean his relatives. He meant the trees, the birds, the mice, the rocks, everything. And so in my own thinking and meditation, I tried to stay connected with all the different circles you were referring to. And I think that's a key part of the orientation to help people reconnect with nature.
Good. Yeah.
Oh yes. Yeah. Well, as for me, you know, I grew up around the Tuba City area, got relocated here to Flagstaff, but I'm from the Mexican clan. I was born into the Mexican clan, which has Spanish origins. Let's see here. I went into the military and I got a forestry degree and worked for the Forest Service for over 20 years. So yeah, I'm pretty familiar with measuring trees and water and weather. And I have seen a lot of climate change happening in my time, and from talking with my mother about her experience of how things dried up.
John, you might be interested. We did a piece last spring called Climate Elders Tell Stories of Change. And among our elders who were telling the story was Shanto Begay. We also had Jim Babbitt and a river runner who's been in town for a long time, Donnie Dove. And we stretched the definition of elder a little bit, and we allowed Coral Evans to join in. But anyway, we've got that on the NASCA website if you want to take a look at that. It's interesting to see how people have experienced change in our area.
Oh, okay. I'll check it out. But yeah, for Navajo, the main focus is to focus on the positive. I call it the positive development of the person, individual, and community. And that they, because that kind of prevents you from misusing the resources. Because in our perspective, everything is dualistic. You know, everything is dualistic. It has good and bad in it, inherently in it. But we as people, it's our moral teachings that unleashes the good or the bad of something. And so we have to focus on doing good, you know, and trying to interact with other people and our relations, you know, the other circles.
I worked in Bolivia for a number of years. And I mean, obviously, I'm not an indigenous person. I was trying to think of where, if I had to introduce myself, I'm not sure. As a Navajo, I got to work on this. You know, I'm history-less. But nevertheless, when I was in Bolivia, I worked very, very closely with indigenous people, and much of what you say resonates with the way Andean native peoples understand reality. But one of the things that struck me that should be bedrock in my own Christian tradition, but unfortunately not as always there, but seems to be bedrock in the Andean tradition, is that of hospitality. You share with each other. It's very similar to what you're saying. And I always found myself when I was out on the high plains, I worked a lot of rural development work. If I ever needed anything, indigenous people were willing to help me and give me a place to sleep, or give me food, or help me get my tire changed, or something like that. So that's sort of what you're saying, seeking the good, or as I was hearing you say, really sharing seems to be very, very valuable. And that's something that is lost, I think, largely in modernity. Capitalism is not very good at sharing, for example. We're very good at acquiring, but not really good at sharing. So I think there's a lot to learn from a non-capitalist culture such as the Navajos, for example.
Well, capitalism isn't, in Navajo, capitalism isn't bad, you know, but the problem is that you don't want to live, like, capitalism is a tool to live life, but you don't want to live your life for the tool.
Ah, very good, I agree.
It's just like money, you know, you need money to live life, but it's a tool to live life, but you're not supposed to live your life for money. And so that it'll fit into that Christian teaching of the love of money is the root of all evil. And so yeah, you need the money, but you don't want to live your life for it, because when you live your life for money, then you stop living life for yourself, your community, and family. If money becomes the main goal of living life. So that's why I say, you know, keep it centered on yourself, the family, and society, and those things that allow those things to function.
Well, very good, John. Very well put. So we've gone a good bit over time. I want to thank you all again for joining in this conversation. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to do it again at some point. Hopefully also in person.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I really got a lot out of this. This has been wonderful.
Okay.
Well, John, thank you for your good help in bringing the comments and questions forward. We couldn't have done it without you, because for me, for reading the fine print of the chat is almost impossible. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
To all of you.
Goodbye to all of you.
All right.
Thanks.
I want to talk
See you
with
soon.
We should.
Thank you.
I hope we get together sometime. I'd like to do
Okay.
some dialogue. I'd like to learn some.
All right. Okay. All right.
Bye-bye.